Good morning. I'm Viola Gonzalez, president of the League of Women Voters here in Oakland. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Yes, we may underwrite grad students to help us with select research, scholars, younger students to assist with specific projects, interns, or professionals with specialty skills such as translators or tech support. But we are primarily a volunteer-run organization, 333 strong. Together with national and state leadership, not just in California, but across the country, we continue to fight against voter suppression and to pursue policies that expand voter access. We see that our voting rights are in peril, and we are determined to stay focused and do the hands-on work that empowers voters and strengthens our democracy. Central to all our work is educating and informing voters, including today. We live in a world where there is too much misinformation, and as much information as there may be exist, perfect information is not possible, yet we must make decisions on what is known and available to us. I want to thank our presenters today, Gail Wallace, Anna Matai, and Deborah Scheffler. I especially call out Gail, who has taken the responsibility to manage a team of volunteers to oversee the review of all our local measures, help train others, and share her knowledge and leadership. Gail and her team have worked hard to provide a thoughtful and honest review on these measures, and as we gather today, let us by choice listen appreciatively, speak with care, honor our differences, and assume good intentions. Vote with the League enables us to promote our mission, political responsibility through informed and active participation in government. Gail Wallace, Vice President of Action Committee, will take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Viola. Viola is someone for whom we are all deeply grateful. She is a steady hand at the helm of our local organization, and perhaps most importantly, has a wicked sense of humor. So that keeps us all going. And I also want to acknowledge other members of our team this morning. As Viola has, we have Deborah Scheffler, who is the past president of the local league and who has headed up the task of shepherding the entire voter services team, which involves forums and registration, as well as informative programs such as this. Anna Matai has been amazing, leading the training of our speakers who have fanned out across the city to make presentations called pros and cons presentations to a variety of institutions and groups. And finally, I want to thank Cleo Korn, who's provided technical assistance throughout many programs, and in particular, will be running the slideshow today. Cleo, and finally, let me remind those of you, or let those of you who joined very recently know that this program is being recorded so that you can share it with others, and we can post it on our website. Cleo, if you start the slideshow, that would be great. The League of Women Voters is a grassroots organization of women and men. We are nonpartisan, meaning we never support or oppose political parties or candidates. However, we do advocate for particular policies and laws. Next slide, please. When we put on our advocate's hat, as we say, we do so only after we have studied the issues in depth and adopted written positions. So when we ask you to vote with, as we are doing today, we do so relying on our studies and our positions. Of course, things do arise in elections that cover areas that we haven't studied. In those cases, we make no recommendation. Let me give you a little preview of our process this morning. We're going to start with the state propositions, and then we'll pause to take questions on any of the state propositions. We will be presenting on the ones where the League does have a position, but we'll take your questions on any and all of the state propositions. Please put your questions into the chat. And after breaking for questions, we'll follow the same process and present on local measures. Our website will have a link to the full recording of the program by Monday. Next slide, please. Here's a little preview for the state propositions. You'll see from the chart that even when we do have a position within the League, we sometimes remain neutral because there are competing positions at play. I think that you'll find some of these some of the most interesting discussions, and we will do our very best to identify what values you would be prioritizing with a yes or no vote. I'm going to let Deborah start us off with a discussion of Prop 1. Deborah, you need to unmute.
Okay, thank you. All right. So Prop 1 is the reproductive freedom, and many of you have probably heard quite a bit about it already. The state legislature put this proposition on the ballot, and it requires a 50% vote to pass, even though it's a constitutional amendment. It only requires a 50% vote, 50% plus one. A recent decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, the Dobbs decision, held that the U.S. Constitution does not protect the right to abortion, overturning 50 years of precedent. Some justices indicated that federal rights to birth control may be subject to a similar fate. While access to abortion is no longer federally protected, it is under attack across the country, but we can safeguard access here in California. Abortion is legal under California state law today, subject to certain public health and safety limitations. So, for instance, rare late-term abortions where the fetus would be able to survive outside the uterus without extraordinary medical measures, unless the health or life of a pregnant person is at risk, in which case even that kind of abortion could be allowed. The California Constitution, unlike the U.S. Constitution, explicitly guarantees a right to privacy. In 1969, that's 4 years before the Roe decision, the California Supreme Court interpreted this California right to privacy to extend to an individual's decision about whether or not to have an abortion. And that right has been codified by our state legislature in our Health and Safety Code. This proposition does not change the law. Prop 1 will simply write into the California Constitution the fundamental right to choose an abortion, use or refuse contraceptives, and make individual decisions on reproductive health. This is not advancing. Now, here are the reproductive freedom positions. Who is funding this? Okay. And let me just, you'll see some of these slides going forward. So let me just interpret that. If it has $3 signs, that means that entity has promoted this in the millions of dollars. So for instance, that would be the California Medical Association is strongly supporting Proposition 1. If there are $2 signs, that means that entity is devoting hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that would be, for instance, Planned Parenthood. And if there is a single dollar sign, it means that they are supporting it, but for less than $100,000. Now, these numbers here may be lagging because campaigns are required to report their contributions periodically. So this would need to be updated. Now, this is really kind of next slide, please, sorry. So this is, like Gail was saying, kind of a values decision. Here are the reasons that, if these are your beliefs, then you would want to vote for Prop 1. So it would make it harder for a future state government to change the law to limit reproductive rights, or for a future California court to overturn existing case law. Access to affordable, comprehensive reproductive health care, including abortion, allows women to plan their lives, protect their health, and achieve their dreams. By expressly naming reproductive freedom as a right in the state constitution, Prop 1 protects access to the care that will give individuals and families the freedom to make those choices. So, the League of Women Voters of Oakland strongly supports Proposition 1. Next slide, please.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. So Prop 31 is a referendum. So it's about banning flavored tobacco products. And it is a referendum on a law that was passed by the state legislature. So let me do a quick reminder about referendums. So the legislature passes a law, the governor signs it. If someone objects, they can then gather signatures. And if there are enough people who sign on, then the law is placed on hold until we all get a chance to vote. So a yes vote on a referendum means you want the law to go into effect, and a no vote means you don't support the law. So now the background. In 2020, a law was passed to ban stores and vending machines from selling flavored tobacco products. So flavors like fruit, menthol, and chocolate can mask or enhance the taste of tobacco. The law was challenged and it was put on hold. And so the law will go into effect only if voters approve this proposition. What are the fiscal effects? Reduced state tobacco revenues could range from tens of millions of dollars to about 100 million annually. Next slide. So what are some of the concerns? E-cigarettes can deliver high doses of nicotine. And in California, almost all the high school students who used e-cigarettes used some flavored products. As adults, we are all pretty aware of the health dangers of tobacco, but for youth, there are additional dangers to their brain development, attention, mood, and impulse control. In addition, tobacco company ads promote menthol flavored cigarettes, and they're aimed largely at the Black communities. So 85% of Black smokers use menthol cigarettes, and tobacco-related diseases like heart disease, lung cancer, and stroke among Black people exceed deaths caused by AIDS, homicide, and accidents combined. The next slide. The League of Women Voters does not have a specific position on flavored tobacco products or tobacco delivery systems. We do have strong social positions, including those related to healthcare and juvenile justice, along with an overarching commitment to equity. And so that's why we are recommending a yes vote on Prop 31.
Okay, Prop 28, more money for arts and music in school. Now, this proposition requires a 50% vote to pass. The League strongly supports a high-quality public education system in California. Because of a variety of voter-supported initiatives which limit and prescribe state and local spending, California does not provide the level of financial support for its schools that the League considers adequate. The state is required to spend a minimum amount on K through 14, that includes 2 years of community college education every year, and that's about 40% of our general fund. And state law requires schools to provide arts and music instruction to all students in grades 1 through 6. And in order to graduate, high school students must complete a year in one of 3 courses of study, one of which being arts and music education. But there is currently no guaranteed source of funding for arts and music education in K through 12 public schools. So this proposition would provide about $1 billion per year in additional funding, specifically for music and arts education. This would equal about 1% of school funding received. We recognize that arts and music education, which has been underfunded in California, is beneficial to student achievement, cognitive development, reading comprehension, attendance, and social emotional wellness. Furthermore, Prop 28 is designed to ensure that low-income schools and under-resourced students, who are often kept the farthest away from arts and music education opportunities, will benefit from the increased funding. Next slide, please. But we see both reasons to support and reasons to oppose this measure. Reasons to support: well, arts and music education can improve a student's personal and academic life. and only 1 in 5 schools have a dedicated teacher for arts programs. But there are also reasons to oppose. Prop 28 would limit the state funds available for other spending. Setting aside funds for specific programs limits flexibility to spend on the highest needs. So on balance, we remain neutral on Prop 28 because making decisions about budget expenditures through ballot measures, so-called ballot budgeting, is not a good policy. It reduces the flexibility our legislators need to react to future needs and makes less revenue available for other important state priorities like climate change, healthcare, and housing. Earmarking funds in this way also limits the ability of local school boards to respond to local needs. And finally, we are concerned that Prop 28 has extensive reporting requirements paired with an unreasonably low 1% cap on administrative expenses. So, as you see, we are neutral. We see both sides of the argument and we're neutral. Next slide.
Great, thank you, Deborah. Prop 29 is about more regulations on kidney dialysis clinics. It is an initiative and it would change the law. The background here, Prop 29 is a repeat of measures we saw in both 2018 and 2020. Current law requires that dialysis clinics have a medical director and they have a registered nurse or an RN on site during treatment. Prop 29 would impose a few new requirements on dialysis clinics, including that they have a physician, a nurse practitioner, or a physician assistant at a clinic when patients are being treated. So up that level of supervision from an RN to these levels. That they make regular reports on dialysis-related infections to the state health department, disclose who owns the clinic, that they take permission from the state to close or reduce services, and that they provide the same level of care for all patients, regardless of how the patients pay. That is, regardless of what insurance patients have. Next slide, please. So dialysis is a serious life-saving, life-sustaining treatment and should not be left to ballot box decision-making. You know, the League supports quality healthcare, cost controls, and equitable distribution of healthcare services. The measure looks simple and direct, you know, at face value, but looks can be deceiving. If passed, it could impact both thousands of vulnerable dialysis patients and clinic staff who are caught between the clinics and proponents of increased staffing. So there really is room for improvement on all sides. And because of these uncertainties about the costs and benefits of the measure, the League remains neutral on Prop 29.
Thank you. I'm going to address Prop 30, and I hope in these last two measures and this one, you will agree with me that some of these ones on which the League is remaining neutral pose some of the most interesting questions and really require us to balance competing values. I call Prop 30 the strange bedfellows proposition, and I think you'll see why as we go on. Let's look at the current situation. Carbon emissions from cars and other vehicles, together with wildfire smoke, constitute the main source of air pollution in California. To address this problem, California has issued mandates. The state began requiring the increased use of zero-emission vehicles in 1990, and now requires that by 2035, all new vehicles sold in California must be zero-emission vehicles. As part of this push, the state has also required ride-sharing companies like Uber and Lyft to have 90% of their drivers driving zero-emission vehicles by 2030. In addition to these mandates, California has been budgeting for climate change. The state recently released a $54 billion climate action budget that includes $10 billion over the next 5 years to subsidize the manufacture and purchase of zero-emission vehicles and to build charging stations and other necessary infrastructure throughout the state. The state climate change will be bolstered by recent developments in Washington. The federal government is making significant investments in zero-emission vehicles and infrastructure pursuant to the Federal Infrastructure Spending Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. So where does Prop 30 come into this picture? That's all what's going on right now, right? There's mandates to meet and there's money coming in on this very issue. Proposition 30 proposes yet another separate and additional source of revenue to promote zero-emission vehicles. That would come by increasing the income tax rate on individual incomes over $2 million by 1.75% for up to 20 years. The money raised would be spent as follows: 45 to promote and subsidize the purchase of zero-emission vehicles, 35% to develop the infrastructure, including charging stations, and 20% for wildfire suppression and prevention that would be devoted primarily to the hiring of firefighters. For each of those percentage categories, at least half of the money would have to be spent on projects that benefit people who live in or near heavily polluted areas or where they live in low-income communities. Next slide, please. As I mentioned at the beginning, I call this the Strange Bedfellows Act because you'll be able to see for yourself as you read through the list of companies and names. The groups aligning on either side of this proposition reveal the differing values prioritized. The environmental and public health groups in favor of Prop 30 are more than doubling down on the importance of reducing carbon emissions. They want to add the billions this tax would raise to the 10 billion California has already budgeted for the same purpose in the next 5 years, as well as to the federal funds that will be coming in. However, the financial driver for this proposition by a large margin is the rideshare company Lyft, which has supplied 45 million of the 47 million that's been spent to pass Prop 30. Analysts are largely in agreement that Lyft's interest lies in shifting the cost for subsidies of zero-emission vehicles and infrastructure to high earners rather than to purchasers. The more subsidies for purchase, the easier it presumably will be for Lyft to meet its mandate to have 90% of its drivers using zero-emission vehicles by 2030. Opponents of this measure are also a somewhat unlikely group, including, among others, the governor, the Republican Party, and the California Teachers Association. Their objections are many. First, Governor Newsom condemns what he calls Lyft's single-handed corporate financing of a measure that could have such impacts on state finances and operations. One result is that the increase would make California's tax rate the highest of all but one state in the country, at a time when California has a $100 billion surplus. Opponents argue that a 20-year tax burden will drive the large earners out of California and that the appropriate venue for financing climate goals is within the state budget. Making huge budgetary decisions through the ballot process jeopardizes other spending for state programs in areas such as education, healthcare, housing, and other priorities. That's why you see the California Teachers Association in opposition. You might ask yourself why more money would undercut other spending. It's because the California Constitution limits how much the state can spend. More money isn't just more money. When state spending hits the limit, known as the GAN limit, the proposition would require the state to reduce an equal amount of spending from other programs to, in a sense, make room for the new required spending on zero-emission vehicle programs and wildfire activities. Opponents also claim that the 20-year tax would limit flexibility to calibrate funding as the fast-moving industry of electric cars and infrastructure evolves, and would limit flexibility to deploy funding in the areas of reducing emissions as well as other areas of concerns. Next slide, please. It will be up to voters to weigh the competing concerns of the need for urgency on the environmental problems that we face and the values of fiscal responsibility. Added to these considerations is the question of whether a choice is really necessary, given that financing from the federal and state commitments already made may offer as much as can be absorbed by the industry and the state regulatory organizations over the next several years. So now we have presented on all of the state measures on which the league has a position. We consider neutral to be a position. And we'd like to stop the screen share and move into any questions you have on the state measures.
So Gail, I'd like to kick us off. There are a couple in chat around Proposition 30. We want to take a look at those.
Yep. Okay, first one, why does Governor Newsom discount benefit to all Californians just because Lyft would benefit? So what I'm hearing in this question is the value that many Californians would benefit from as much subsidy as one could get for the purchase of zero emission vehicles, and that Lyft's involvement shouldn't be a deterrent to allowing that benefit to take place. I think that what I have read suggests that what he's objecting to is this kind of massive budgeting outside the formal legislative budget process and the potential for impact on other areas of serious state concern, like the funding of housing and education. And then the question is, if it passes, will Lyft benefit more than other ride sharing companies? No. And I frankly have no answer as to why Lyft is the only one that has entered the funding in such a big way, because the effect for ride sharing companies is a kind of secondary effect. They're not getting any direct money. What this would do is increase the money available for subsidies for purchasers of electric cars. So the secondary effect would be that maybe more people would have them, and therefore the pool of people that Lyft could hire or any other ride sharing company could hire would be available to them, and therefore facilitate their business because they would have an adequate pool of employees to grow their business. Do we have any other questions on any of the other measures? I don't want to neglect to note that we did not present on Props 26 and 27, which are the gambling propositions, because the league has not sat down and studied those and developed positions around gambling. But if you have specific questions, we're happy to take them on any of these measures. And then I have another question. Are there concerns that Prop 1 could endanger protection of reproductive rights? That enshrining those rights in the Constitution is not the most effective strategy to protect them, depending on how things evolve at the federal level. Deborah, I'm going to hand that one over to you.
Okay, well, that seems to have a couple of parts to it. So in terms of being the most effective way of enshrining the right in California, putting it expressly in the Constitution is the most effective way of doing that. It's currently implied through the privacy protection. The word privacy is express in the California Constitution, sort of a Bill of Rights. And then it is expressly interpreted as applying to abortion in our health and safety code and in a Supreme Court decision that preceded the Roe decision. So putting it in the Constitution just solidifies it, and as kind of we went over it, it means that a future state legislature that wants to change the statute won't be able to do that because it will be in the Constitution, or a future court that wants to, sort of like the United States Supreme Court, suddenly decide that after decades and decades, it no longer applies. So putting in the Constitution is the best way to ensure the right into perpetuity. And then I'm not sure that the other part would be, so at the federal level, I'm not sure if this is what you're alluding to.
I think Deborah just froze. Is that true for everybody else?
Anything like this, but were the, excuse me? Yeah, but were the Republicans or were opponents of abortion rights to take over Congress, they would likely, or there already have been moves to impose a national standard. And it would, like one of them would forbid abortions after 15 weeks, others would forbid abortions after 6 weeks. A couple have already been proposed. So what would happen to the California rights in that case? That would really be up to the courts. It would in part depend on how any federal law would be phrased and how the courts would interpret it. There are some areas of the law where the federal law has what's called preemptive rights. That's where the federal government, the area of the law sort of occupies the field, and to have contrary state laws would impede the enforcement of federal law. In other areas, there's federal legislation, and then there's state legislation that may differ in some ways. So we really can't say at this point what the impact of that would be. I'm not sure if that was your question, but I think that was.
Thank you, Deborah. And Cleo, I'm actually going to kick this next question over to you. What is a zero emission vehicle? Is a hybrid considered zero emission?
Yeah, so I don't know how Prop 30 defines this, but I can say that the regulation that Gail mentioned to ban the sale of new gas-powered cars by 2035 and require that all sales of new cars in 2035 be zero emission. That includes a certain percentage. I want to say it's 20%. I'd have to check. Of those zero emission vehicles can be plug-in hybrids. So that regulation that will be going into effect and build towards the 100% ZEV sales requirement for 2035 does include plug-in hybrids. I don't know if Prop 30 takes that into account in its language.
Deborah, you've got another question on Prop 1 here. I'm going to read it. Is the placement of reproductive rights, thank you, Cleo, by the way, in the California Constitution tied to privacy only or to other legal ways of ensuring people's rights?
Well, it has been primarily tied to privacy. And as I mentioned, the big distinction between the federal constitution and our state constitution is that the word privacy exists in our state constitution, and it has for many decades. And it doesn't exist in the federal constitution. So it was purely a matter of legal interpretation and in the Roe decision by the Supreme Court. And there have been other theories, like an equal protection argument that there are only people who can become pregnant are affected, and men, there's nothing comparable for men, so therefore there's an equal protection argument. And many legal scholars have supported that, but the current law in California really hinges on this right to privacy.
And that's what we would augment by making the right to reproductive freedoms explicit. It wouldn't have to be just an interpretation. We would have said, yeah, actually, we mean this. We mean that it includes this. Yeah.
Right. That's why they use the word enshrining it in the Constitution. So it doesn't change the law, but it does exactly what you say. It enshrines it.
Great. Thank you. Anna, this one is for you. Will more money for the arts, as is proposed by Proposition 28, mean that existing arts funding be moved elsewhere? Is it truly an addition?
Yeah, I'm going to bump it back to Deborah.
Yeah.
Sorry, got that one mixed up.
Yeah. Well, the issue is that there isn't really dedicated arts funding. So it's kind of, whatever is available at any given time. There's no requirement for a certain amount. So, and the important thing about 28 is it is an addition. So currently approximately 40% of the general fund of the state goes to education. And this would be an additional $1 billion, which is about 1% of what's already going to education. So it's not a question of displacing other money, unless, I mean, in a sort of indirect way, you are taking another $1 billion out of the general fund. And, you know, it could be spent on many other things, and maybe legislators have higher priorities for it. So in that sense, it does potentially displace other funding.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment. So you'll have time again after we present the local measures to put questions in the chat. And at that point in time, we're happy to continue answering questions about the state measures that occur to you as we go along, or as well to take questions about the local measures. And we'll start our presentation on those right now. So Cleo, if you could begin the screen share again.
I just wanted to flag out that Bonnie has her hand raised before we do that.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bonnie. Do you want to unmute, Bonnie, and ask your question? You're muted, Bonnie?
Okay, so just one further little comment on the previous question. Oh, so some school districts may use some of the money that's already given to them by the state, by the Proposition 98 for music and art, and it would be their discretion as to whether or not they stopped spending that portion that in the past they had spent on music and art and replaced it with the new money, or whether they would keep that money that they had already been allocating for music and art and supplement it with the new money.
Thank you, Bonnie. It's helpful. Education spending gets very complex, right? Because it involves all of these state and local levels. Appreciate it. Okay. If you'll start the slides again, Cleo, and Deborah, I think we lead off with you. Oh, sorry, lead off with a slide that I put in here, analogous to the state measures, so that you can see that unlike on the state measures, it's very interesting. Locally here, our positions led us to either be in support or in opposition. And we don't have that same slew of neutral propositions or that we had with regard to the state measures. Okay, next slide, please.
Okay, so in 2014, Oakland voters approved Measure N, and this was a 10-year parcel tax to fund the College and Career Readiness Act and for education in areas such as business education and healthcare. The goal was to improve high school graduation rates with an innovative program highlighting career paths as well as rigorous academics. Students in the program benefited from professional mentors. Well, they do benefit from professional mentors, internships, jobs, and technical training, as well as academic, social, and emotional support. The impact has been positive and significant. In the years after this program began, that is from 2015 to 2019, before the pandemic, overall graduation rates increased by 12 percentage points, from 61 to 73%, and graduation rates among Black students increased by 15.4 percentage points. In addition, dropout rates for all students have decreased 11%, and for Black male students by 17.9%. But Measure N will expire in June of 2025. So Measure H would extend the Measure N parcel tax of $120 for 14 years, with exemptions for seniors and low-income households. The measure requires an independent auditor to issue an annual report and an audit. Now, if you believe that Measure N has been effective in improving academic metrics, and it has, and in providing career pathways, which it has, internship opportunities and counseling that benefit high school students, then you would support a measure like this. One could argue that this successful program should now be integrated into OUSD's budgeting, but reliance on current school finances would jeopardize the program's future. Absent changes to Prop 13, a parcel tax is one of very few ways to ensure consistent funding and secure this successful program for our youth. And next slide, please. Therefore, the League endorses this College and Career Fund continuance, and we urge you to vote for it. The language in the city's charter needs updating to honor Oakland's commitment for inclusivity and representation. Adopting, oh, I'm sorry, this is the wrong slide. Sorry. Okay, that's it. We urge you to vote in favor of Measure H.
I'm going to address Measure Q, which comes before us because there's a constitutional provision in the California Constitution saying that if a city wants to build affordable housing, voters must approve the units of housing in advance. This law is likely to be repealed next year and was put on the books as a kind of additional hurdles for cities wanting to build social housing. It is generally considered to be a product of a repudiated era of racism and redlining. Nonetheless, it's there. So to be able to build affordable housing units for low income and very low income residents, Oakland needs these authorizations. It's a separate question of whether they will have the funding to do that and the streams of funding. These are simply authorizations that as projects come online, there would be these authorizations in hand that are necessary for the projects to go forward. The specific request is for 13,000 affordable housing units. There are no fiscal effects from it because it's a simple authorization. And I've been mentioning the low income housing. That's not the only kind of housing that the city is interested in building. All cities are now under mandates from the state to augment the housing for all levels of income. However, this law particularly addresses a city's desire to build housing for low income and very low income populations. Next slide, please. We urge you to vote yes. The League supports this. We believe it is important that the city have the authorizations in hand to address what everyone agrees is a very grave housing crisis in the region and in our city. Deborah.
Sorry, I just unmuted there.
I
All
don't-
right. So
Yeah.
Measure R on
Sorry.
gender neutral language. So this would again change the charter and requires a pass percentage of 50. So what's the background here? The Oakland City Charter uses gender specific words to refer to city workers and officials. So for example, the charter uses words like firemen, and the charter also uses male and female pronouns like he and she. So Measure R would change the city charter by replacing gender specific words with gender neutral words. For example, the city charter would use the word firefighters instead of firemen, and the city charter would also use gender neutral pronouns like they instead of he and she. Measure R is not expected to have an effect on city income or spending. So next slide, please. So the language in the city charter needs updating to honor Oakland's commitment to inclusivity and representation. Adopting gender neutral language would acknowledge the current diverse makeup of city staff and the full spectrum of their gender identities. The proposed changes would also align Oakland with the professional guidelines from the League of California Cities and with state policies and legislation. So for all these reasons, the League supports equal rights and equal opportunity for all and urges a yes vote on Measure R. Next slide, please. So Measure T, this is on business tax rates and again requires a pass of 50+1. So what's the background here? Oakland businesses pay a tax to the city based on their gross receipts. So this is a flat tax, which means that all businesses in a given category pay the same rate, no matter how much they earn. So recently, the rates for residential rentals and cannabis businesses were changed. So those are not affected by Measure T. However, for all other businesses in Oakland, Measure T would change the tax code to make the tax a progressive tax, which means that the more a business earns, the higher the tax rate they would pay. This measure is a result of extensive negotiations among the city council, labor, and business communities. They had each been considering separate measures and they worked together to find something that they could all agree on. The major differences were about the actual rates rather than making it a progressive tax. And a little bit more background, also note that San Francisco, San Jose, and Richmond all have progressive tax rates. So next slide, please. So Measure T would generate approximately 21 to 22 million each year for the Oakland General Fund. Next slide, please. So the league recognizes that it might be beneficial to introduce tax rates, new tax rates more gradually, but we also strongly support the extensive work that led to Measure T. So the groups work together to balance a variety of competing concerns about rates and revenues. And so we strongly support this overdue update to the city's business tax rates and structure and urge voting yes on Measure T.
Okay, over to me for Measure U. I want to take a moment with this first slide to remind ourselves of why cities issue bonds and how they work. Because Measure U asks us to do some authorizations for bond money. Bonds are a city's way of borrowing money to finance large capital expenditures. Bonds have a rolling life cycle that can easily last 5 to 10 years. And the cycle includes multiple stages. Measure U concerns the first stage and asks you to authorize a certain amount of indebtedness. However, that does not mean that the city will immediately move to the second stage and take on the debt. Even if Measure U passes, the authorizations would be used to issue bonds in what they call slices or tranches in a years-long process. Then projects would be planned, approved, and completed also over the course of years. Repayment would occur in compliance with the interest rates and timetable that were negotiated for each slice of bonds. Property owners would repay the debt as they do now through an annual assessment, which is a percentage per $100,000 of assessed property value. I'll just note as a reminder that assessed value is different from and usually less than market value. Next slide, please. Measure U can be considered the successor measure to Measure KK, which voters approved in 2016. As you can see from this slide, we're being asked to authorize bonds in the same categories of housing, transportation, and facilities repair and upgrading. The amounts differ. Under Measure KK, affordable housing was the least of the categories. Here, it's now in the lead with an ask for an authorization of 350 million. Again, relating back to the mandates that cities are under from the state, as well as just the need in our community for additional rehabilitated and new affordable housing. Next slide, please. Let's answer how Measure U will affect the city's ability to undertake infrastructure projects, and also the question of how it will impact property owners' taxes. I'm going to take the first one first. To finance its plans for the much needed affordable and social housing, Oakland will need more than the $1 million that is left in the housing portion of Measure KK funds. Also, as I've mentioned, California is requiring all cities, including Oakland, to develop plans for meeting targets for housing, including affordable housing, which will also require money. As this housing category of Measure KK bonds gets spent down, as well as the other categories, Oakland will need additional authorizations, which they're asking for here, to continue the work on housing, transportation, and facilities upkeep. So let's ask what the effect on property owners' taxes will be. And in answering that question, we need to talk about the city's recent adoption of a debt limit policy. As I mentioned, property owners pay for the city's bond indebtedness at a percentage rate that's multiplied by every $100,000 of assessed property value. So in this debt limit policy, the city has said they will not increase that percentage rate beyond 0.22%, which is what this year's estimate was. And actually, I got my tax bill the other day, and it's actually 0.20 as it comes out, but essentially the 0.22% that they were aiming for in this debt limitation. That means that taxes, which this year are around 200 per 100,000 of assessed value, will not rise any higher than 220 per 100,000 pursuant to that debt policy. So how do they keep the lid on, you might ask? How do they honor that policy? They manage it by issuing new tranches of bonds only as the old ones are paid off or the tax base expands. For example, if you're a property owner and you get a tax bill now, you're paying on the city's current accumulation of bond indebtedness. That includes bonds for police and fire pensions, which probably will be some of the first paid off, as well as some of the KK bonds, as well as some of the bonds from Measure DD, which financed certain improvements around the lake. So those bonds in this rolling cycle will get paid off. And in a sense, room will be made for the city to issue the bonds that will be authorized by this measure if it passes. Next slide, please. We recommend support for this measure. It will allow the city to address critical housing needs, to continue transportation upgrades, and to repair and upgrade facilities, such as our libraries, without raising the current rate of taxation above this year's level, just maybe 0.02%. And that's because of the new debt limit policy. Measure use provisions comply with the guidelines in the League's position on responsible local government. For that reason, we recommend you to vote yes. Next slide, please. All right, moving to a completely different topic here. I often say when we make these presentations that you get a little bit of that effect of channel surfing because we move from topic to topic, but it just helps us understand how very complex state and local government has been, and to meet our responsibilities with the kind of votes that are required of us, we have to really become quite versed in a lot of these complex areas. So Measure W concerns how to make campaigns fairer and more transparent. And we're talking about local campaigns for public office in Oakland. It offers a suite of changes. There are 4 principal ones. The first is a plan for publicly supporting candidates for office, that is with public money, so that not only those with connections to large donors can run for office. Additionally, there are proposals to make sponsors of campaign advertisements known, to limit campaign contributions, and to require elected officials to wait several years after leaving office before doing any lobbying of public officials. Next slide, please. Let's look at these proposals of Measure W in more detail. The first one, limited public financing that we have now. Oakland has a problem with money in politics. Less than half of campaign funding come from Oakland residents currently. And of the part that comes from Oakland residents, it's contributed by only a small fraction of Oaklanders, usually those more affluent, who are making contributions to candidate. As a result, those who have connections to major donors have a significant edge in seeking public office. And this is true despite the fact that Oakland does have a limited public financing program, which our Public Ethics Commission that runs the program declared inadequate several years ago. It's after the fact funding for city council members running for office. Measure W would create a new campaign funding program modeled on the Seattle program. Through this program, registered voters and other eligible residents could receive 4 $25 vouchers. They could donate these vouchers to candidates of their choice for mayor, city auditor, city attorney, council member, or school board director. Candidates who participate in the program would need to limit their total campaign spending and provide campaign spending reports. A similar program in Seattle has succeeded over the past 3 election cycles in increasing diversity among their candidates and increasing participation in elections throughout the city across racial, age, and socioeconomic groups. Additionally, Measure W would lower the limits for donations to candidates from $900 to $600 for individuals, businesses, and organizations, and from $1,800 to $1,200 for large political committees. Measure W would also require that the 3 highest contributors to a campaign and with respect to any advertisement be disclosed on all materials supporting or opposing Oakland candidates or measures. And there would be no lobbying until after 2 years after leaving office. Next slide, please. Some object that we have more pressing problems, but to the League, of course, there is no more pressing issue than supporting our democratic process. Yes, there are these associated costs, which I've detailed on the slide in front of you, including $700,000 in startup costs, approximately $1.6 million a year, mostly for additional staff for the Public Ethics Commission, which would administer the program, and $4 million every 2 years to pay for the candidate vouchers that I mentioned. However, I want to note, since these numbers seem rather large, that if we express them as a percentage, this would amount to approximately, maybe slightly less than half of 1% of Oakland's budget. Next slide, please. If making democracy work is your mission, as it is ours, we urge you to support this Measure W and vote yes. Next slide, please.
Okay, that's back to me. All right, now this one is going to take a little bit of time to go through, so please bear with me. But understanding all the parts of it is a big part of helping you understand what our position on it is. So Measure X provides a number of things. So the city of Oakland has 8 council members, the 7 districts, and then 1 at large, and they are elected directly by the people of Oakland. The council sets the goals and priorities for Oakland, approves the city budget, adopts laws, and appoints members to various boards and commissions. Now, this measure would make certain changes to how our government operates. So first of all, currently, there are no term limits for city council members. They can stay in office for as long as they keep winning elections. Measure X proposes to limit council members to 3 consecutive terms. However, they can run again after sitting out 1 term. Council members can put measures on election ballots. Currently, measures may be placed on the ballot after only 1 public hearing. Measure X will require 2 public hearings before a measure may be placed on the ballot. Council members vote on city laws. Currently, when voting by council members results in a tie, the mayor casts the deciding vote. If a council member wants to prevent a tie, they can avoid casting their own vote. This prevents the mayor from being able to cast the deciding vote. So Measure X will count council members' abstentions or absences as no votes. Next, currently, the Public Ethics Commission sets the salaries for council members. With Measure X, the PEC will set council members' salaries every 2 years using the Consumer Price Index. Next, currently, council members set the salaries of city auditor and city attorney. With Measure X, the PEC will set the city attorneys and city auditors' salaries based on salaries of similar positions. Currently, the city auditor and city attorney are allowed to support candidates and ballot measures with money, endorsements, and help with campaign activity. Measure X would not allow that. Next slide, please. And finally, currently, the city auditor's office is not required to employ a specific number of staff members. Measure X will give the city auditor more responsibility and require that the city auditor have government experience. The city auditor's office will need to employ at least 14 full-time staff members. Next slide. Reasons to oppose. Well, Measure X requires voters to vote on a bundle of unrelated changes to city governance. It is not a comprehensive reform. It's a piecemeal approach to fix some issues. The changes include term limits that are not absolute and allow candidates to run again after sitting out one term. While some of these proposals have merit, individually, bundling different reforms together in one measure does not give voters the option to vote for some reforms, but reject others. It requires blanket approval of all the proposals. Changes to the charter and rules for governance are foundational. Proposals should allow a clear expression of the voters' will and should reflect more extensive community discussion. Next slide, please. Therefore, we oppose this measure, which may be a little surprising because the League, the main thing it does is we promote good government initiatives. And, some of these proposals may, in fact, as I mentioned, be good ideas. But it's kind of a process issue that we have, which is we don't believe that a whole potpourri of unrelated matters should be put before you in one to vote them all up or down. So it's on that basis that we oppose this measure. Next slide.
Great. Thanks, Deborah. So Measure Y is the zoo parcel tax. And again, it is an initiative parcel tax and so requires a pass of 50%. So what's the background here? The city of Oakland owns the zoo at Nolan Park and contracts out its management. Its budget currently, it's about $24 million. And about 15% of the visitors to the zoo are from Oakland. So what this Measure Y proposes is a new 20-year parcel tax on Oakland property owners to support the zoo. And the additional revenue from the proposed tax would be spent on the full range of zoo's operations and programs and therefore benefit all visitors. However, Oakland residents are only 15% of annual visitors to the zoo, but they would generate 100% of the increased revenue. So for example, in the first year, that would mean Oakland property owners would support a 50% increase in the zoo's revenues. Next slide, please. So the tax would impose a $68 assessment on all single-family homes and units, and also $68 on every unit in a multi-unit residence, while taxes on non-residential properties would vary according to the square footage and frontage measures. The zoo's current annual budget is about $24 million, and the tax would raise about $12 million in additional funding. The next slide, please. Oakland and Alameda County tax revenue already provides some support for the zoo and other valued cultural institutions that serve the broader community, such as the Bow Space and Science Center, Fairyland, and Oakland Museum of California. While it may be appropriate to increase that support in the case of the zoo or other institutions, the cost really should be distributed in a way that does not disproportionately impact only Oakland property owners. Since this measure does not achieve that, the League opposes Measure Y and recommends that you vote no.
Next slide, please, Cleo. I want to turn your attention to a page on our website, because at this point in some of these presentations, you may have reached overwhelm. And the experts tell us that when we listen to something for the first time, it's a little bit like applying the first coat of paint. You may need to go back and touch it up a little bit. And we've got the resources for you. On our homepage, if you go there and you put in League pros and cons, you can see that there is a one-page document as well as a 2 to 3 minute video that you could watch to hear presentations on each of these measures that we made with our education hat on. Also on our homepage, you would be able to click either to find this video or to find written Vote with the League explanations to support the positions that we are presenting to you this morning. So I want you to notice here that we presented on all of those in which we have a decided recommendation for you to support or to oppose. There are 2 others, that Measure S on non-citizen voting and Measure V on expanding the just cause for eviction ordinance. As with the federal with the state propositions, we're very happy to answer questions in this upcoming period on any of these measures, including those 2. Next slide, please. Thank you for being a voter. Thank you for coming. Don't go away. We're going to launch into questions, but we wanted to make available to you, and I think it's also been placed in the chat, that we have this wonderful resource of our website where you can find the recorded forums for the candidates, as well as this wealth of information on the issues. You can go to votersedge.org, another wonderful resource for actually typing in your address and seeing what will be on your actual ballot, as well as a wealth of information on candidates and voting information. And finally, we'd be remiss if we didn't ask you to join us in the work of making democracy work and become one of our members. You'd be very welcome. Thank you, Cleo. I think we can end the slideshow there, and let's take a look at your questions.
So Gail, maybe I'll start you off from the one from Bonnie, starting with what is social housing?
Social housing, is an interesting term, and it seems to be used somewhat interchangeably, Bonnie, with the idea of housing that will serve low income and very low income communities, and then involves some support from an involvement of the city government. So I'm going to address just the municipal level, where the city would be putting in some of these housing funds, whether to purchase properties or, put matching funds into grants and these kinds of things. But the idea is it's going to that level of housing development, which would provide housing for those people who have the fewest resources. Thanks for the question. I'm going to take another question here, if I may, early in the game. And I appreciate this question. It says, regarding Measure U, the Easy Voter guy said property owners could expect to see an additional yearly tax of $70 per 100,000 of a property's assessed value. I thought I just heard that it would not change our annual tax. This is a wonderful question, and it reflects how difficult it is to capture all the information about a bond measure. So it is true, if you read the question on your ballot, that the actual text of the question mentions a figure of approximately $70, right? That would be associated, that's their estimate, because these bonds haven't even been approved or authorized, much less issued. And no contracts have been negotiated for how these bonds, if they're approved and issued, would actually cost. But that's the best estimate given projected market conditions. However, that doesn't mean that by the time these bonds are issued and projects are developed and are starting to cost $70 per 100,000, that your particular tax bill would go up by that amount. Because I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, when we as taxpayers get our bill, like, you don't know, I would guess, unless you're really a specialist, what's in Oakland's bond portfolio right now, right? So you don't know in the $200 that's being charged per 100,000 of your assessed value, how much of that is going to pay off Measure DD bonds, how much of it is going to pay off the bonds for police and firemen pensions that are still city obligations, nor do you know, or I know, how much is going to KK bonds that have been issued. Similarly, down the road, if Measure U passes, we're not going to know in terms of the whole city's bond portfolio what's in the bucket, right? But if Measure U passes, at least $70 of what's in the bucket at some point in time will be from Measure U bonds. But will that mean that the bill you got would make it $70 more than now? No, because it's a rolling thing, right? You know, some's being taken out of the bucket, some's being put in. The way the debt limit works, which is a policy, not written into the charter, but a policy that the city council has adopted and committed to. In my mind, they're kind of drawing a line on the bucket, you know, like a line on a measuring cup, saying you can't put more in here that if it'll take us above this line. So what that's saying is, now you're paying 200, you know, we still need more money. And as things roll along in time, we're making a promise to you that we won't make your yearly tax bill more than 220. We won't put more debt in the bucket than we can service by charging you either 220 or less. So with respect to your particular question, when we wrote the Easy Voter Guide, we wanted to honor the fact that at some point in time, what's in the bucket might be $70 for some of the Measure U bonds. But I think it was inartful of us, and we're in the process of changing it on the online version of the Easy Voter Guide to say that your taxes as they appear to you in terms of the check you would write would go up from the current level. And I invite Devaki or whoever asked that question, if that doesn't answer it, to please submit more. Helen's got a question about how long are current council terms? Deborah?
Okay, I saw that answered in the chat, but council terms are 4 years.
Great.
And they're split. So we have the even number seats and I guess the at-large in this is 22. So in odd elections, and then excuse me, we have even number and odd numbers in different years. So we do have an election for the council every 2 years, but they're for different seats.
Great. And I've got a question again on Measure U, because frankly, municipal financing is complex. So I'm happy to get all these questions. If Measure U passes, will property owners also be assessed for Measure KK? Well, remember that Measure KK was authorized in 2016. A lot of those bonds have been issued. That was an authorization. The bonds have been issued pursuant to that authorization. They will be continued to issue bonds under KK until the money runs out. Remember, there's 3 categories: housing, transportation, and facilities repair. The housing, which was the one that got the least money, is you know, probably understandably the one that's going to run out first. It's got $1 million left in it, and we all know that doesn't go far for producing housing. So what would happen is they have, if Measure U passes, you would have Measure U authorization, and the first bonds that would be issued under that authorization would be for housing, right? But they would continue issuing KK bonds under the other categories until they had used those up as well. And then again, you have that idea that they won't issue new unless servicing old and new debt does not require charging taxpayers more than $220 per $100,000. So a lot of moving pieces, but I hope that helps with that one. Cleo, do you see any other questions here?
So let me take the one on the zoo. I think what Donald's asking is to repeat the position on why we are urging no against the zoo. So let me just repeat the position. So overall, the thinking is, Oakland and Alameda County tax revenues are already providing some support for the zoo and, similar institutions like Chabot Space and Science, Fairyland, and Oakland Museum. And while it is appropriate to increase, it may be appropriate to increase that support in case of any of these institutions, we really feel that the cost should be distributed in a way that does not disproportionately impact only Oakland property owners. So, again, for the zoo, at least from the last year's entrance numbers, about 15% of the zoo visitors to the zoo are from Oakland, while this measure would increase the revenue by 50%, and that increase in revenue would all be borne by Oakland property owners. So since we don't think this is equitable, the league is opposing the measure. I hope that helps, and please, again, either type into the chat or raise your hand if you have further questions.
And I want to maybe just add a word, if I may, Anna, about the league's position. We have positions on local government, on long-term financing like bond measures in local government, and also on parcel taxes. We really do scrutinize parcel taxes as they get away from the absolute center or the heart of property taxes, which our position says should be used for things that are really core city operations, such as libraries, etc. So, I don't know how you all would draw the map, but obviously as we get away from some of these core things, and which is not to say things aren't important, but maybe just slightly, differently weighted, the scrutiny increases as to fairness and other issues. And I got a question the other night that some people, I don't know whether you said, Anna, that that Oakland owns the zoo. So, I mean, it is appropriate to make an ask, right? And owns, other things. And the Oakland contracts out the management of the zoo. And so it is definitely connected to the city of Oakland, but currently it's getting 8% of its funding from a complex of entities, government entities, Oakland, the county, as well as the East Bay Parks District.
So Gail, there is a question then on how much money can a candidate spend from their own personal funds on a campaign?
Interesting.
Or is there a limit, I guess is the question. Is there a limit as to how much money they can spend?
And that would be under the proposed measure, I'm going to guess.
Maybe you can say present and future.
Yeah, I'm not sure as to I'm not sure that we have that rule. And if anybody in the audience knows that already, I would love for you to jump in. And there are a group of limitations on the candidates, and they agree on overall spending limitations under the new proposal. And that would impact personal contributions, but I don't have at my fingertips an actual dollar figure for any personal contributions.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Helen around Oakland candidates. We haven't received any information from the registrar about Oakland candidates. And do we have any measure? And maybe that would be a plug for our easy voter guides.
Yes. So if you go to your Oakland Easy Voter Guide, no, to Voter's Edge, wouldn't that would be the
Yes.
place we want to direct you. And Bonnie, you're welcome to unmute and jump in here as you are the doyen of Voter's Edge. But if you go to Voter's Edge and you type in your address, and Cleo has just put the link, then you will see all the candidates that you will be asked to vote on, as well as the measures. And candidates are solicited and urged by us to put information in the Voter's Edge. And Helen is saying, why aren't we getting official word from the city? I don't know, Helen. I don't have the answer to that one.
So what kind of official word, Helen, are you referring to?
It seems to me in the past, we've gotten a description of measures and candidates from the city.
No, actually, we've received that from Alameda County, and I do not understand why we did not receive true sample ballots from Alameda County this election. The booklet that we
Okay.
received is only about the measures, has nothing about the various candidates whom we're voting for, and we need to direct that question to the ROV. I was stunned.
Okay, so we're not the only one. We're not the only ones who got skipped. Thank you, Bonnie.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Bonnie. Does anybody have any other questions about, let's see, we have a new message here about some of the things we haven't addressed. Measure Z, Anna, was that you on that? Or, sorry, measure Y. It says measure Z in the question, but I'm assuming we're talking about measure Y.
Right. So thank you. I was just trying to parse that. So the question is, would the current city budget allocation be decreased accordingly? No, so what's written into the measure is that the current funding cannot change. So any additional money generated by the parcel tax would be on top of the current city allocation.
Right.
And then Bonnie's got a hand up.
Yes.
Go ahead, Bonnie.
You need to unmute, Bonnie.
One additional piece of information that might be of interest is that about 85% of the visitors to the zoo are from the Alameda County. So 15% from Oakland and 85% from Alameda County. And then what would the balance be?
So Bonnie,
it wouldn't be any balance. So why
so
is
Bonnie, it would
the
actually
county
be
measure?
65% from Alameda and then the rest from
Oh,
elsewhere.
65, thank you. I knew there was a balance there somewhere. So, but still 65% of the visitors, that probably includes Oaklanders, but 65%, why is it at a county measure, I guess, could be reasonably asked. Why did they make it just an Oakland measure rather than a county measure?
Okay, and I again want to give you a moment to let any other questions bubble to the surface. And remind you that you will see other measures on your ballot, props 26 and 27 on the gambling measures at the state level, and measures S and V on non-citizen voting and on eviction controls. So if you have questions that arise, let me remind you that on the website you have both that you have pros and cons on those, both for the state measures and for our local measures, as well as the 2 to 3 minute videos. So lots of resources. If when you get to that point in the ballot, you say, darn, I should have asked this question. Or we're happy to give you any explanations now, if you would like them. Am I missing any questions here?
Gail, you might want to point people to cavotes.org, which is the state education funds website, and that's where people will find the state pros and cons. cavotes.org.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And so you can go directly there with that link, and that link is also at the bottom of the page of our website, which has the pros and cons on the local measures and those videos that I've been talking about. So 2 ways to get there, resources for you, as well as the recordings of our forum candidates. Okay.
If I can just jump in, Gail, actually Bonnie brought up a good point, which I'd forgotten about. So there was a measure, an Alameda County measure to fund the Oakland Zoo, I believe in 2012, which required, I believe, a 2/3 majority, and it did not pass. So I just wanted to point that out also.
Yes. And this one is different. It will require a simple majority. Okay. Viola, I didn't ask you whether you wanted to make any closing remarks, but if you're there and would wish to, we welcome them.
No, I just want to thank everyone who attended, and thank you very much for your participation today. Questions are welcome, and certainly want to thank Gail and her team, and not just the ones that are present today, Deborah, and but there are many others that behind the scenes who helped put the analysis together, and thank you so much.
And join the league.
And join the league.